November 1944. Somewhere inside the perimeter of Third Army's rear echelon in France, a military policeman, an American military policeman, wearing the same eagle on his helmet as every other soldier in that theater, was beating a black soldier. Not in combat. Not under fire. In camp. On American-controlled ground. With his fists and his baton, because the man he was striking had, by some account too trivial to survive the historical record, stepped out of the invisible line that separated black soldiers from the spaces the Army had decided, without written order but with complete institutional consensus. Belonged to white men. The soldier on the ground was not fighting the Germans that night. He was fighting his own army. Word of what happened traveled. In Patton's Third Army, very little stayed secret for long. The general had informants, aides, and a temperament so volcanic that officers competed to bring him information before he discovered it himself. When the report of the beating reached him, and it did reach him, General George S. Patton, commander of the most aggressive armored force in the European theater of operations, made a decision that nobody predicted. What he did next would expose a war inside the war. And what it cost him to do it is the part nobody tells. The military police of the United States Army in 1944 were not a neutral institution. They were an instrument of the social order that American society had exported to Europe, along with its tanks, its rations, and its racial hierarchy. In the American South, from which a disproportionate share of the Army's white enlisted men and officers had been drawn, the enforcement of racial separation was not merely custom. It was reflexive, physical, and frequently brutal. That reflex traveled across the Atlantic without losing a single degree of intensity. The Army's official segregation policy meant that black soldiers lived separately, ate separately, were entertained separately, and were policed by an MP Corps that was overwhelmingly white and that carried with it the full weight of civilian assumptions about which men deserved protection and which men deserved control. The military police had broad authority in rear echelon areas. They could detain, discipline, and, as documented in multiple wartime reports compiled by the NAACP and the War Department's own Inspector General, beat black soldiers with near total impunity. By the autumn of 1944, the NAACP had delivered a formal memorandum to Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson documenting at least 40 separate incidents of violence against black soldiers by white MPs across the European and Mediterranean theaters. 40 documented cases. The actual number was understood by everyone who examined the evidence to be considerably higher. Most incidents were never reported, because reporting them required black soldiers to trust a system that had demonstrated, repeatedly and with institutional consistency, that it was not on their side. Patton knew these numbers existed. He had not needed the NAACP's memorandum to understand that his rear echelon was a place where a different war was being fought. What he did not yet know, on the night the soldier was beaten, was how personally he was about to take it. The soldier beaten in Patton's camp was not an abstraction. He had a rank, a unit designation, and a body that carried the bruises. The specific names in this incident have not survived the historical record with complete clarity. The Army's record keeping on racial violence was deliberately incomplete. A bureaucratic silence that mirrored its institutional indifference. But the fact of the beating, and the fact that it reached Patton, is documented in the accounts of officers who served on his staff, and in the broader pattern of Patton's conduct toward his black troops during this period. Here is what made this incident different from the 40 cases in the NAACP's file. This happened inside Patton's perimeter. On ground, he controlled. By men who wore his army's insignia. And that, for a man whose entire military identity was built on the proposition that everything inside his command reflected directly on him, was not an abstraction either. It was personal. The problem had two layers, and Patton understood both. The first layer was the beating itself, a crime against a soldier under his protection, committed by other soldiers under his command. The second layer was deeper and more dangerous. if white MPs could beat black soldiers in Patton's own camp without consequence, then every black soldier in the Third Army had a rational reason to wonder whether the general who had spoken to them at Morlaix on October 13, 1944, who had told them he did not care what color they were as long as they could fight, had meant a single word of it. And an army where the black soldiers didn't trust the general was an army fighting at less than its full strength. That was not a moral calculation. That was arithmetic. And arithmetic, in armored warfare in the winter of 1944, was a matter of life and death. Patton summoned the military policemen involved. The accounts of what happened in that room vary in detail. Aides who were present in the corridor outside reported raised voices, the kind of sustained, controlled fury that Patton's staff had learned to distinguish from his theatrical rages. The theatrical rages were performance. The controlled fury was when he meant it. What Patton communicated, through whatever words he chose, was the operational principle he had already demonstrated at Morlaix, and again when he stripped a white captain of his command for refusing to salute a black lieutenant. In the Third Army, military law applied to every soldier equally, or it applied to none. There was no middle position. A selective law was not law. It was license, and Patton did not issue licenses for brutality inside his perimeter. The MPs were disciplined. The specifics of that discipline, reduction in rank, reassignment, formal censure, varied by account. But the disciplinary action was real, and it was documented by Patton's staff in the Third Army's operational records. This was not a reprimand delivered quietly and filed away. Patton made certain that the outcome was visible. He understood, with the strategic instinct that made him genuinely dangerous as a commander, that a punishment nobody knew about was not a deterrent. It was a secret, and secrets, in an army that ran on rumor and unit identity, protected nobody. Word traveled through the 761st Tank Battalion and the other black units attached to the Third Army with the speed that information always travels through armies, faster than official communication, slower than wishful thinking, and carrying exactly as much distortion as the teller's own fears. Added to it, what arrived was not a transcript, it was a signal. The general had acted. The MPs had been punished. The system, for once, had not looked away. Sergeant Samuel Ransom of the 761st, one of the battalion's most decorated NCOs, a man who had already survived the brutal armored engagements at Gebling and Bugeltroff in November 1944, later recounted in post-war interviews that the change in atmosphere inside Third Army's rear areas after Patton's intervention was palpable. Not perfect, not transformed. The institutional racism of the United States Army did not dissolve because one general enforced one principle on one occasion. But the temperature dropped. MPs in Third Army's area began, with measurable if imperfect consistency, to police black soldiers the way they were legally required to, as soldiers, not as a population requiring suppression. This was not nothing. In the context of an army where 40 documented beatings had produced 0 prosecutions, a single enforcement action that carried consequences represented a statistical break from the established pattern so sharp it bordered on the impossible. But they weren't prepared for what came next. Because Patton's intervention did not end with the MPs. It extended to the officer corps. He issued what his staff recorded as a standing instruction, not a formal written order, because Patton distrusted paper when direct communication was available, that any complaint from any black soldier in the Third Army about mistreatment by white personnel was to be brought to his attention within 24 hours. Not to the Inspector General, not to the JAG office, to him. Personally, this was an extraordinary deviation from military bureaucratic procedure, and every officer on his staff understood exactly what it signaled. Patton was placing himself between his black soldiers and the institutional machinery that had been grinding them down. The Germans were watching all of this, in their way. The Sicherheitsdienst, German military intelligence, maintained active monitoring of American radio traffic and, through neutral country newspapers and intercepted communications, a limited picture of American domestic racial tensions. German propaganda had been attempting since 1942 to exploit the contradiction between America's war for democracy and its treatment of its black citizens. Goebbels' ministry produced pamphlets dropped over black American troop positions suggesting that the enemy they were really fighting wore American uniforms. Most black soldiers recognized the propaganda for what it was and ignored it. But the Germans weren't wrong about the contradiction. They were simply wrong that it would break the 761st's fighting spirit. It didn't. If anything, it sharpened it. December 1944. The Ardennes. The German Army's last great strategic gamble, Operation Autumn Mist, launched December 16, 1944, along an 85-mile front through Belgium and Luxembourg, tore a hole in Allied lines that threatened to reach the Meuse River and split the American and British armies in two. Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B committed 29 divisions, including 10 armored, to the assault. The weather grounded Allied air power. The surprise was nearly total. Patton's response is among the most studied command decisions of the entire war. In 72 hours, he wheeled the Third Army, an operation involving approximately 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, across roads that were frozen, narrow, and already congested, 90 degrees to the north, and drove toward Bastogne. Military historians have called it the most remarkable staff achievement of the Western Front. The 761st Tank Battalion drove with him. On December 31, 1944, and into January 1945, the 761st engaged German armor near Tillet, Belgium, a town of fewer than 300 inhabitants that became the site of some of the most brutal armored combat the battalion would see in its entire 183-day deployment. The German forces defending Tillet included elements of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and supporting panzers, experienced, desperate fighters who understood that the Ardennes counteroffensive was failing and who intended to sell every meter of ground at maximum cost. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens, Company B, 761st Tank Battalion, directed his Sherman through conditions that German tankers in their heavier Panthers and Panzer Force were finding nearly impassable. The American Sherman M4 weighed 33 tons. The Panther weighed 45. In frozen Belgian terrain, in January, with ground pressure becoming a decisive tactical factor, the lighter American tank moved where the German armor bogged. This was not doctrine. Nobody had planned for this specific advantage. It emerged from the conditions of the ground on that specific morning, and the men who recognized it and exploited it were the ones who survived. The 761st took Tillet. They took it against resistance that Major General Horace McBride, commanding the 80th Infantry Division, described in his official after-action report as determined and skillfully conducted. 3 members of the 761st died in the engagements around Tillet in those first days of January 1945. 11 were wounded. The Germans lost 2 panzers, confirmed destroyed, 1 captured, and control of the road junction that anchored their defensive line in that sector. General Model, reviewing the Ardennes campaign from his headquarters as January ground toward the inevitable German withdrawal, had access to intelligence assessments that identified the units opposing him. The presence of black American tankers, the 761st, the only black armored battalion in combat in the European theater, was noted in German intelligence summaries without particular comment on their race. Because German military intelligence evaluated units by their combat performance, and the 761st's combat performance was, by December 1944, beyond dispute. They were, by every metric that Model's staff applied, a first-rate armored battalion. The theoretical framework that had kept them in training camps for 2 years had not survived contact with the evidence. German after-action reports, when they mentioned the 761st at all, described them the way they described any dangerous American unit, with professional respect and tactical concern. The Germans, in other words, had solved the question that the United States Army had spent 2 years pretending was still open. They were too good. By any standard. Period. The validation of Patton's intervention, Both his discipline of the MPs and his combat deployment of his black units came in layers, each one harder to dismiss than the last. The first layer was immediate and tactical. In 183 consecutive days of combat, from November 1944 through May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion was attached to no fewer than 6 separate American infantry divisions. Each divisional commander who worked with them requested their continued support. Not one filed a negative assessment of their performance. Major General Willard Paul of the 26th Infantry Division formally recommended the battalion for the Distinguished Unit Citation in 1945, writing that they had established an enviable record of achievement in combat across the Lorraine Campaign, the Ardennes counterattack, the breach of the Siegfried Line, and the drive into Germany itself. The second layer was statistical. 11 Silver Stars. Over 70 Bronze Stars. Reuben Rivers' posthumous Medal of Honor, finally awarded January 13, 1997, 52 years after his death, by a government that had spent half a century finding reasons not to formalize what every man who fought alongside him already knew. The kill ratios, the mission completion rates, the operational tempo the battalions sustained across the harshest winter of the war, all of it demolished the theoretical infrastructure that segregation had been built upon. The third layer came from the enemy. Post-war interrogations of German officers who had faced the Third Army's armored elements in the Ardennes and the subsequent drive to the Rhine produced assessments that were consistent and professionally delivered. American armored forces in this period were tactically flexible, logistically, sustained at a level German units could not match, and willing to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives that German commanders would have considered optional. None of the German assessments made racial distinctions. They evaluated American armor as a category and found it formidable. The fourth layer was Patton himself. In his diary entry of November 1944, Patton wrote, with characteristic bluntness and without apparent awareness that his words were, by the standards of his era, remarkable, that the performance of his black units had exceeded my expectations in every measurable respect. For a man whose expectations had been shaped by the same cultural assumptions that shaped every white American general of his generation, exceeding them was not a small thing. It was an empirical revision. He had expected less, he had received more. He adjusted his assessment accordingly, the way a competent commander adjusts any assessment when the evidence contradicts the theory. The counterintuitive truth at the center of this story is one that the Army's architects of segregation could not afford to confront. The system designed to protect white soldiers from the supposed deficiencies of black soldiers was, in operational fact, the greatest deficiency in the entire Army. Every black soldier who was denied commission was a potential officer the Army never had. Every black tanker who spent 1942 and 1943 in a training camp instead of a combat theater was a trained warrior being wasted. Every MP assault on a black soldier in a rear echelon camp was a corrosion of unit cohesion, a tax on morale, an advertisement to every black soldier in earshot that the Army did not consider them worth protecting. The system was not merely unjust. It was self-defeating. Patton, whatever his private beliefs, grasped the operational implication in a way that most of his peers did not. When he disciplined the MPs, he was not performing moral leadership. He was removing a source of operational friction. He was eliminating a malfunction in his Army's machinery. The fact that this act of operational maintenance happened to align with basic human decency does not diminish it, but it does clarify it. He was not ahead of his time. He was simply a better engineer of military organizations than the people who designed the segregated Army. Executive Order 9981, signed by President Harry Truman on July 26, 1948, formally desegregated the United States Armed Forces. It came 3 years after the war ended, 2 years after the Gillam Board confirmed what the 761st had already proven in blood, and 33 years before the 761st received the Distinguished Unit Citation that Willard Paul had recommended in 1945. The soldier beaten in Patton's camp in November 1944 never received a medal for what he endured. His name is not in the official record. He is the blank space in the document, the one the Army's recording apparatus refused to make visible, because visibility would have required accountability, and accountability would have required change. Patton changed what he could change. The Army changed the rest, slowly, imperfectly, too late for most of the men who had earned the change. Emphasis on this: the lesson is not that one general can fix a broken system. The lesson is that a broken system always costs more than the people who built it are willing to admit. And that principle, that the maintenance of an unjust order always carries a hidden operational price, does not belong only to 1944. It belongs to every institution, in every era, that mistakes hierarchy for strength.